Hey photographers, welcome to the Bokeh Podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Holritz, and I'm here to help you build a sustainable photography business. That means improving your photo skills, building on your business knowledge, and honing your marketing abilities. But it also means helping you work more efficiently so you don't get burnt out in the long run. We do try to bring the show to you commercial free, so make sure to check out our sponsors, photographersedit.com and Miilu, Miilu.com. Photographer's Edit is custom photo editing for the professional photographer, and Miilu is the simplest way to create and manage timelines and shot lists for the events you're photographing. Again, photographersedit.com and Miilu.com. All right, let's get into today's episode. All right, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we are back for another Bokeh Podcast episode. And I'm literally so excited. I just slapped the ring light next to me, moving my hands about wildly. I have a brand new guest with me today, Kristen Krehbiel. Thank you so much for hanging out with me, Kristen.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
Well, me too. And I know that kind of sounds like a cliche thing to say, but really, I'm truly excited. I told you before we started recording, I was just telling my team about you and the conversation that we had at the hybrid conference. You started talking to me about what you're doing for the sake of your business with Pinterest. And I was kind of blown away, and you were so articulate and just very talented in the way that you were able to communicate what you were doing with Pinterest. I was like, hey, can we do a podcast? And you were graciously willing to do so. So here we are. We're going to get into the conversation about Pinterest in a little bit, but we normally start off the Bokeh Podcast episodes with a series of questions, usually the same questions for each of my guests coming on. And the first one that I'd like to ask has to do with brand position or the value proposition, hopefully the unique value proposition that your business offers to your market. Now, I'm going to break the fourth wall a little bit. You and I actually chatted about this briefly before we started recording. You mentioned to me that this was not a concept that was very familiar to you and that you're actually in the process of working on developing your brand. So can you give all of our listeners and myself a bit of context?
Yes. Yeah. So I've started the rebrand process. Everything that I've done up to this point has been kind of on my own. I've kind of just pieced it together. And okay. I feel like too, in the kind of the beginning, I feel like it is kind of that just naturally happens, right? You just are I don't know what I'm doing. So you just kind of start and you kind of hone in on, the areas that you want to focus on. And so I do know that I focus on elopements and smaller weddings. Yeah. And then I'm also wanting to get more into branding, a lot more branding, working with small businesses and things like that. Okay. So I'm starting to work with a brand designer and strategist and trying to come up with exactly all of those, who I'm targeting and the proposition and what makes me different and unique. And I feel like it's so hard to do for yourself as well. So working with an expert is really great. So I'm kind of in the beginning phases of that still and working through that, which is great. But it's a lot of work to dive into and really find your uniqueness, I guess. So
it's true. Well, I mean, there's so many photographers. You're based in the Vegas market, right?
So we actually just moved to Southern California.
Oh, okay.
So I'm Vegas still for elopements, but then starting to try to break into the Southern California market a little bit as well. Okay. So that's also a good time to rebrand, right? When you've just moved and, things like that too. So.
Well, so, I mean, whether it's Southern California or Vegas, these are both really crowded markets as far as photographers go, wedding photographers go. I know that elopement photography has become more and more popular as well. So trying to stand out amidst the crowd of photographers with something that is distinct can be really challenging for sure. Has the research process started? Are you looking at your competition, trying to figure out how to stand out amongst that so-called competition?
Yes. So that's what we've kind of started that process. And she was looking at different people. And I think a lot of it was the editing. How I edit is very different than a lot of other elopement photographers. So that was kind of a point, kind of the more natural tones, the film look is a little bit different than a lot of other elopement photographers. So I think that was a point of kind of differentiation, on, just by looking at the photos. But just authentic is a word that kind of kept coming up, uniqueness, bringing out that in people, kind of providing a calming experience. That was kind of some of the words we were looking at, and deeper connections. I'm a like just being able to talk to people. I've kind of been decent at that, like having conversations and kind of like those deeper connections.
Yeah, I have to jump in too and compliment you too, because the conversation, we had never met prior to the hybrid conference a couple of months ago, but the conversation there was so easy. And I don't meet a lot of photographers who I guess are comfortable enough with themselves and genuinely curious that conversation just flows. You know how when like you meet somebody, or maybe somebody that you already know, and you get the sense that they're genuinely interested when they ask a question. They have this kind of inquisitive look on their face, and they're actually paying attention, like they're keyed in, they're looking at you.
Yes.
It's simple things like that surprisingly aren't necessarily the norm, and you're really great at that. And it made conversation really easy, and the back and forth was really easy. I can only imagine how that just translates wonderfully to your clients, and would make a big difference in the way that you're able to continue to book clients, especially in that new market.
Yeah. And that's what I'm hoping to, in finding, that uniqueness. But like you said, and it's so hard too, I think, when it's yourself, you just are like, oh, that's how I am. And you don't necessarily see all of those, things as easy. So It's been really good having a person kind of helping, being like, yeah, this is how you are. This is who you are more so. And, helping kind of flesh that out a bit more. Yeah. So, but yeah.
Well,
I think that's a big thing.
If I could throw out a couple of ideas, just kind of stream of consciousness, if you will, because I was glancing at your website earlier and then listening to you talk too. I mean, you actually have, and for anybody listening in is curious, if you go to Kristen, Kristen, Kay photography.com. And by the way, it's Kristen K Photography on Instagram as well. We'll link to both of those in the show notes, but you have a position statement of sorts right there on the homepage and above the fold even. This is something we talk a lot about here on the podcast, making sure that statement is above the fold so the person that lands on your site doesn't have to scroll to find it. It says very simply, unique, non-traditional desert elopements and weddings for laid-back lovers. Now, that, I think anyway, that is something that you could potentially run with, or at least a version of that. When I look at specifically non-traditional desert elopements and weddings, in and of itself stands out. Unique is almost kind of repetitive, because if it's non-traditional, it's likely going to be unique. And laid back lovers, and unless you want to kind of filter out those who, anybody but those who are like totally chilled out all the time, may not be necessary, but that non-traditional desert elopements, if you back that statement up with really creative desert imagery, which, by the way, for those of you who are curious, go to Kristen's Instagram. You're going to see some of this stuff. It's just really gorgeous work. You back it up with that imagery. That in and of itself could be really strong, because the thing about talking about connection is that other photographers do the same thing. It's become kind of commonplace. Saying you're unique, if 20 other photographers within a 100-mile radius are also saying they're unique, then the potential clients like, so who's unique? Who's actually different here? Rather than confusing them with a statement that somebody else is using, if you go the direction that nobody else is, and back that up with the imagery and the whole experience, you'll immediately make that much more of an impact.
Yeah, no, I love that.
I think there's a wonderful opportunity there to go really strong in the paint with as far as shooting in Southern California. I know that you have access to some desert landscape, maybe not quite as much as Vegas. Is that something that you're going to continue to photograph in, that type of environment?
Yeah, so I live about an hour from Joshua Tree, so that's beautiful. Another big desert. Yeah. So we're pretty close to that, and then also Palm Springs is about like 35-40 minutes. So it was actually perfect, like this whole desert, because I can still go to Vegas and do desert stuff there, and then I'm an hour, from the desert here in Southern California, a couple of really popular desert areas. And so that it just kind of made sense. And then Palm Springs as well is very colorful. Like downtown Vegas is very colorful. So kind of bringing in that really colorful, like vibe of both of those places as well, I think was also pretty important. And then of course, the desert, I love the textures and all that. And I think it kind of shows through in some of my work as well. So it totally worked out of like where we moved to kind of be able to keep doing that type of thing. And it's like such a niche market of like desert, and a lot of people think the desert's ugly, but I find a lot of inspiration in it. So totally. Yeah, I think kind of running with that way it's kind of worked out. And thankfully I don't have to completely rebrand from Vegas. We're still like about 4 hours from Vegas. So it works out great that way too.
Oh yeah, you can, especially, I mean, taking a flight over there is $50, $100. You could shoot a wedding or shoot an engagement session and pop back over. I mean, that's nice that you can kind of tap into both those markets and you continue with that desert theme. I'm actually looking at a shot on your Instagram profile from back in May 17th of 2019. So about a year ago, that you photographed in Red Rock, and it looks like a bride and groom or potential engagement session, but with the desert and then the kind of mountains rising up in the background. It's gorgeous, gorgeous stuff. So for everybody listening in, make sure you go check it out, because this is some really lovely stuff. And and good luck with that branding process, because I know that can be challenging, but it looks like you've got something really strong to build on.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yes, it is a challenge. And then, but hopefully we'll get through it and it'll all come together and, make sense. So I'm excited.
Well, we were talking about your ability in conversation, and this is a great segue to my next question about customer experience. What has been one of the most important principles that you have found in providing a really great customer experience for your clients?
So along with that, communication is a big thing I have found, and then really understanding their needs and being able to help them a lot. And also I found just being kind to people and, understanding and that type of thing, I think are the best, honestly.
Yeah. And it's funny again, and I know I've said this before on the podcast, but it's funny how the simple things, the things that should be normal, that should be expected, they aren't. And so when we actually follow through on those consistently, it really can make a big impact. People want to feel genuinely cared for in one way or another. They may be missing out on that in some way, whether it's a total throwback to their childhood and issues they're dealing with from that, or just in the last week, their friends or family hasn't reached out to them. Whatever it might be, you have the ability as a photography business owner, and those of you listening in, same thing, to be able to make an impact just by smiling, being genuinely interested. It makes a really, really big difference. So that's a really great reminder. But I want to get to another question. You mentioned to me, you were talking about your husband, you all moving. Trevor is, of course, his name. But you and Trevor, how do you make time for each other amidst being a busy business owner as well? Have you found an effective way to balance working with personal life and having, balance may not be the word, but happy with, I guess, the time that you're able to give to both of those things? Is there a particular workflow technique that you've learned?
Yeah, I feel like I'm always working at getting better at this.
Okay.
I don't think anybody's really mastered it maybe either, but yeah, I feel like it's always a work in progress, because there's always exceptions or things that kind of come up. But I've really been trying in the evenings to just put my phone down and not be on my phone quite as much. I mean, maybe like a little bit, if there's something super important, but just really trying to, put it away and just really be present. I feel like it's so important, especially nowadays. We're just so distracted. So yeah, really being able to be present. And then another thing that I've been working on is not, checking and responding to my emails like very first thing in the morning. Sometimes I'll check them, but I won't respond. Like I'll just kind of look through and see if there's anything crazy that needs my attention. But most of the time I don't respond until later in the day. I try to focus on other things in the morning rather than getting sucked into emails right away. But yeah, so that's a couple of things. We've also been doing a lot of walks recently with our dogs, and kind of, leave our phones back and, just be able to talk and walk our dogs and enjoy being outside, especially during this time when it's kind of a slower time and can't really go anywhere anyway. So walks have been really great. Getting sunshine and, kind of getting out has been awesome. It's the simple things sometimes that really can make a big difference. I just recently got a puppy, and naturally I'm forced taking him outside regularly. And it's funny how even just the simple experience of some fresh air in the morning when it's a little bit cool can be quite invigorating. Same thing going out in the evening too. It's really lovely, but it gives us a break from sitting in front of that screen all day. Absolutely. Yes. I know getting the dogs we have two, and getting them has been one of the best things, because it makes me get up and move rather than sit in the computer, or sit in the computer chair for hours and hours and be like, oh my gosh, I haven't gotten up forever. So yeah, they come in and they bark, or they, kind of tug at me like, Mom, let's go play. So we go, get up and move even just for a little bit too, has been really great.
Love it. Love it. Talk to me about outsourcing, delegating. This is something related to time management. Is it something that you've experimented with in some element of your business? And if so, have you found any benefit from it?
Yes. So my number one thing that I have outsourced that I will never do myself again is in my taxes. So hiring a guy to do that has been literally worth every single penny that I pay him.
Oh
And I
yeah.
sometimes tell people, yeah, I'm like, I would gladly pay him probably like double or triple what he charges me. I won't
We
tell
won't
him
tell
that,
him.
but
Yeah.
yeah. But no, it's honestly, I did it, I think my very first year in business. I was like, okay, TurboTax or whatever, I'll try this. And I cried for hours, I think, trying to do it.
Yep.
And after that, I'm like, never again. I'm going to figure out who to hire and get that done by somebody professional because I do not want to deal with all those numbers and all the laws and the rules. And nope, not worth it. So yeah, that's definitely one. And then like we talked about too, hiring a branding expert has been what I'm working towards now, kind of working with somebody with that. And then I want to hire somebody to kind of like revamp and redo my website. Right now, the one I have is just kind of pieced together by me. I've been a lot of DIY is what I have done for a lot of my business, but I'm trying to work towards, kind of getting things more professionally done and hiring experts and things like that. So this was a good question. I like it.
Well, and you're obviously practicing this regularly. It really is true that, especially that, I mean, it's I guess a little bit more natural to outsource the things that are annoying to us or frustrating to us, like accounting. I mean, that was my biggest source of pain as a photography business owner, largely because I just didn't manage it very well. And had I been more proactive, not only and a little bit of work that I need to do, inputting numbers or otherwise, but then also hiring an accountant to work with actively, consistently, on an ongoing basis. Had I done that sooner, I would have been in a much, much better place. So you're highly intelligent for making that move when you did, because that is something that we can really suffer under the weight of if we're not proactive about it. I think it's really great. Is there in the process of kind of giving up, I mean, it's one thing to give up something you don't like, and I guess this is kind of what I was getting at, but what about the things that you enjoy ish, but you feel like it would be a better business move to go ahead and delegate anyway? Is there something that you've learned about communication in that process that's helped you delegate more effectively?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I feel like it's really hard because I know there are things that I should start to be delegating more, but I really enjoy too just learning each piece. So like with Pinterest, I've like really gone, kind of deep with that and learning about it. And now that I know quite a bit, I'm like, okay, I think I could hire somebody, pay them, a little bit, and they could kind of manage a lot more of that, or hire somebody to actually write up a blog post for me, or, just think like little things like that are such a time suck for me that I could easily, kind of hand off to somebody else. I think for me, what holds me back a lot with this too is finding somebody and like somebody that I can trust and like that I really work well with and that understands a lot about like the business and, and does a really good job. So I think that's just been like the hard thing is kind of letting go of that control, which probably is a lot of, maybe some other people are like that too, but
included,
that's
for
been
sure.
a hard thing. Yeah. Okay. I was like, I can't be the only one that loves the control of everything.
Well, we're so used to running our business as sole proprietors. And the thing I've said before in the podcast is we're used to talking to ourselves, right? We don't have to actually take the thoughts in our mind and somehow figure out how to translate them to a language that somebody else can understand. And so in some ways it's convenient that way, but then we find that we become overwhelmed many times because there are so many moving parts. So I love that you're moving in the direction more and more of delegation. And I want to encourage all of our listeners to do the same thing. At the very least, do what Kristen did and find an accountant if you don't have somebody to work with. Get QuickBooks Online if you haven't already. Start just putting the data in there and they can take it from there. And it makes everybody's life easier. I think that's a smart way to go. Talk to me about inspiration. I mean, I can imagine that you are somebody who kind of soaks in the idea of inspiration. Maybe you find it in different places, but are there places outside of the industry, outside of photographers' Instagram accounts, that you find inspiration for your photographic work and for your life as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, totally. So I find it, of course, nature is a big one. Like the desert, I find really inspiring, the textures. And then also flowers. I have been really getting into like floral design and flowers and playing with those. I think like the colors and the textures are just really inspiring. And I tell a lot of people I feel like I'm a florist at heart. Like I'm a photographer, but I feel like I'm kind of more of that like earthy, just, the textures, and florists always seem to be like the nicest humans on the planet. And so I'm like, I feel like I'm kind of more of like the hermit type. Like I'm, kind of want to be behind the scenes almost. So I'm like, I feel like I should have maybe been a florist, but yeah, I do. I love playing with flowers. And I've been in quarantine. When I go to Trader Joe's, I'll grab a few different types and I'll start playing with them, and have been kind of doing like some different arrangements and things like that to stay creative.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's been really fun, too. I really love doing that. And then, so design wise, I love mid-century modern. It's like one of the things we've been obsessed with for quite a while. So like the architecture and the design, like I just find it so interesting and unique, and like kind of funky and weird, and like shag carpet and pink toilets, and like just kind of these like really weird, and all the natural light. Like I feel like mid-century modern just has all this incredible, natural light coming into like their homes and architecture, and it's so different, which now living close to Palm Springs, I'm in love with, because it's filled with that, so I just walk around in amazement. So yeah, I love mid-century modern. So that's another big one too.
Yeah, that whole area around there, Palm Springs and Joshua Tree, is just stunning. It wasn't very long ago that I had the opportunity to go out there with a photographer friend of mine, Chad de Blasio. We rented motorcycles and basically rode out into the desert after WPPI one year. And man,
oh my gosh,
it's stunning. It's stunning, that look. And you're right. The idea of a little mid-century modern house tucked in underneath some palm trees in Palm Springs. I mean, it's just like, the idea is just lovely.
Yeah. It's incredible. So yeah, we hadn't even visited Palm Springs. We had been dying to when we lived in Vegas, but we just never had quite found the time. And then moving down here, that's like one of the places we would go, out to dinner and things like that. Yep. So we're excited to kind of get back into doing that a bit more, and even just driving around the city and looking at houses and finding all the craziness. And the desert too just has so much weirdness. Yeah. Like, I don't know if anybody else, but it's just always, you're just driving around. You're like, what is that? Like a random, even if it's natural or man-made or whatever, there's just so much weirdness in the desert, which I love. So,
it's so fun. Have you ever been out toward the Salton Sea?
No, not yet. But that is a drive I want to do. Did you go out that way?
Yeah, that was part of that same trip.
Oh my gosh.
And when you walk out onto this so-called beach, which basically is like a combination of sand and fish bones, you literally reach your hand down and pick up a handful, and you can see the fish bones in your hand.
Oh my gosh.
It's the wildest thing. Yeah, definitely going to have to go. By the way, you mentioned design being inspiration, and I haven't mentioned this in the podcast before, but there is a particular app, first of all, that I use as kind of a source for photography news, tech news, because that's kind of related to what I do. And then I also follow design news, and the app is called Feedly, but the blog that I follow is called Dezeen, spelled Dezeen. Have you heard of it?
No.
If you get a chance, check it out, and we'll link to it in the show notes for everybody listening in too. But I follow their feed, and they produce quite a bit of content, and it's nice sometimes it's nice to break outside of the photography industry and photography related news or even tech news and look at something different. But sometimes just looking at the lines of like a piece of furniture or the interior of a home or a watch or a car, whatever it might be, can in and of itself be quite inspiring, and in some ways kind of drive me to be better in what I'm creating. And so I find some inspiration in that too. And I highly recommend that blog to everybody.
That's awesome. I'll definitely have to check it out.
Cool. And talk to me about books. This is something that we talk about regularly on the podcast. In fact, we have a whole section. If everybody listening in, if you go to Bokeh, Bokeh, bookshelf.com, there is a collection there of the most popular books that have been recommended here on the show. Haley put that together as a resource, so make sure you take advantage. But Kristen, what has been one of the most impactful business or self-help books that you've read or listened to?
Yeah. So, Okay, so I'm not the biggest reader.
Okay.
I've just never have been. I don't know. I always felt like lazy reading, which is totally not true, but it was just kind of how I am. But once podcasts started coming out, I
Yeah.
was like, okay, I can totally get into this because they're shorter, right?
Yep.
They're like
Yep.
an hour long. You can listen to them while you're doing something. You know, like learn little tidbits about things. It's not like an entire book that you're dedicated to. And I feel like they're just so engaging. So yeah, so I've been like a huge podcast fan. And then also I love learning and just getting stuff from like online courses and free content that people are putting out, honestly, is how it's kind of like my reading. You know what I mean? I do that. So Darcy Benicosa is one that I've learned quite a bit for with courses. And then Tailwind actually puts out a ton of content about Pinterest. So that kind of related to this topic is I listen to a lot of their Facebook lives that they do because they put out a ton of really good content. So yeah. And then of course, you know, there's like a couple of podcasts too that I really love. One is James Wedmore. He's like a businessy one because I try to break out of the photography ones a bit as well, like get perspective from other industries. I've learned that from a few people. So I try to, okay, like who can I kind of pull some knowledge from outside of the photography or wedding world or, you know, things like that. So yeah, so James Wedmore was a great one. And then, so but a bunch of different people I kind of pull from and, you know, love learning from.
Well, and we'll link to all of those resources actually that you just mentioned. We'll put them in the show notes at bokehpodcast.com. And it is nice to have a variety because it can be very easy to get fixated. Yeah. I've pulled up a number even just recently, just trying to kind of stay in touch with the industry and what's being discussed and talked about. I want to make sure that I don't get too kind of blinders on, focused on just what I know and what I'm doing. And I pulled up other podcasts, but I find other photography podcasts. I find myself very quickly going outside of the industry. I'll listen in for a second or two, but then I'll go back to like I listened to Joe Rogan. Are you familiar with Joe Rogan?
Mm-hmm. Yes, my husband, Trevor loves Joe Rogan. He listens to him all the time.
And I have to admit, I do as well. It's one of the ones that I hit regularly. But the thing about Joe is that he brings on such a wide variety of guests, from comedians to, you know, presidential candidates to Elon Musk has been on there a couple of times, and scientists. I mean, it's such a wide range, and Joe speaks to them very personally. It doesn't feel like it's a show that's being put on and highly produced. He's just having a conversation with them and asks genuinely curious questions and calls their bluff when things seem kind of weird. I just love it, but it brings a nice variety. And to my point about variety, I think it's good for all of us as business owners, as artists, to consume a variety of content, and certainly from a variety of people as well, because that'll help us be more creative. It'll help us think outside that little tiny box that we sometimes get stuck in.
Yep, absolutely. That's what I found too. I'm like, okay, I've got to break out of the box. Like, and you know, I try not to follow a ton of other photographers, you know, because I don't want to pull inspiration, you know, completely from within the industry. It's like trying to pull inspiration and ideas from outside of, I think is really helpful. But sometimes it's hard, of course. Like you get stuck back into like your little world, and you know, your friends are in that too, but which is good to support them too.
Oh, for sure.
But yeah.
Well, it's nice to have a comfort zone. We just have to remember that the comfort zone isn't necessarily going to drive us to be even better than we've already, you know, worked to become, if you will. So it's not about right or wrong as much as just occasionally branching outside, and it really can help educate us and grow us, and in some cases inspire us. So, but speaking of, your conversation with me at the hybrid conference I mentioned earlier was pretty inspiring, pretty incredible, honestly. When you started talking to me about what you have done with Pinterest for your business, I seem to remember there was some really incredible stats that you shared to me, even like the amount of traffic that you were getting to your Pinterest page. I was kind of blown away by. But can you just give a little bit of context to kind of get this conversation started, as far as what Pinterest has done for your business, the kind of traffic that you're getting to your Pinterest account and to your business as a result?
Yeah. So the number that they show on Pinterest is like the reach or whatever. So that's like that big number. So mine right now is 1.4 million, which seems crazy, but
it's wild.
It's like, right. But it's also, so that is kind of a mix of all the pins that I've been pinning. And I pin other people's pins as well, and their blogs and things that I think my audience will enjoy. I know some people pin a lot less of other people's and focus mostly on their own, but I do kind of a good mix. But yeah, so that number is big. I think because of that, obviously it's not just all my pins that are getting that reach, but then I looked into Google Analytics to try to kind of see how much traffic is actually coming to my website.
Yeah.
And so in the last 90 days, 95% of the social network traffic is from Pinterest.
That is wild.
And like 5% from Facebook and less than 1% from Instagram. So it was like crazy that it's so much traffic that's coming in from there. And so of course, there's times then like the drop off rate, you can look at kind of all these numbers and like, get really, really deep.
Yep.
But Pinterest too, like you can get a lot of clicks, but then sometimes like they don't really stick around. Probably, when I'm on Pinterest, like sometimes I accidentally click and I'm like, oh shoot, I didn't mean to, go there. I was just kind of searching. So it's probably things like that, kind of a higher click off rate. But yeah, it's still pretty cool how much traffic it can really drive to your blog and to your website, which then of course helps with SEO. And so I looked into my clientele to kind of see how much came from Pinterest, like, because I asked where they found me.
Yeah. And
so it was 31% for last year for my clients. 31% found me from Pinterest and 31% also found me from Google. And for me, I feel like with Google, I think Pinterest has really helped my Google rankings and my SEO and helping people find me on Google.
Right.
So like if you kind of combine those two, it'd be about like 62%, or whatever. So like a pretty big, amount of my clientele. And then of course, inquiries on top of that, like that's been a huge traffic source for inquiries and, people kind of coming my way. It's been awesome.
To say the least. That's amazing. And I don't know, maybe this kind of dates me because I stopped shooting full time back in 2012. But even since, the conversations that I've heard from photographers have vastly centered around Facebook and Instagram. And then even more so in recent couple of years or so anyway on Instagram, because it's image centric and photographers tend to spend, it seems like, most of their time there. And yet here is this massive potential resource for business in Pinterest. And I didn't really get turned on to the idea until I interviewed somebody for the podcast. It's been a number of months ago, Cherie Davenport, and we'll link to her episode in the show notes as well. But she was sharing some stats with me. And again, I was just kind of blown out of the water. I didn't realize that Pinterest, and again, this is going to show my naivety as far as, being a photographer, but I just didn't realize that Pinterest, for the most part, wasn't anything more than just, a really cool place to go scroll and look at pictures, or, to pen ideas to decorate your home with or whatever. But it's actually a massive opportunity for photographers to book new business. And one of the reasons that probably the main reason that I wanted to have you on the show, Kristen, is because I don't think that is commonplace knowledge yet. I know that plenty of people are doing it. They're taking advantage of it, at least to a point, but I don't think it's commonplace knowledge. And it's a vast resource really that photographers could tap into. So I'm excited to have you on the show to talk about it. And I love that you started us off with like actual stats. And by the way, for everybody listening in, if you don't have Google Analytics plugged into your website and you're not reviewing it, at least once a month to get a good idea of how potential clients are interacting with your website, make sure you get that plugged in, because it really is important, especially for the sake of SEO, to know where you're getting traffic from. And Pinterest can certainly be a massive source for that. So let's talk about how you're making this happen, Kristen. First of all, following trends. I mean, if you're going to post content to Pinterest, you want to make sure that you're posting relevant content, obviously. How do you follow trends to make sure that you're doing just that?
Yeah. So actually, there's a brand new tool, and it's just available in the US right now because it's kind of in beta, but it's called Trends. So trends.pinterest.com is where you find it. And so in there, you're able to type in and find out like what is trending within Pinterest and when it's trending. So of course, Christmas, those type of posts would probably be trending around like October, November, maybe into December, things like that. So it's really cool to really see like the graph and how much things are trending and, compared to other keywords. So you'll just type in the keywords and that kind of gives you an idea, which is a really cool tool. And it's newer, so I haven't used it a whole ton, but that's a really cool way to kind of look at what the trends are. And then again, I I look at too, I mean, you can, of course there's trends, right? But if it doesn't have anything to do with your niche or with like the clientele you're trying to attract, then I feel like it doesn't make sense to just write out, trendy topics. So I've kind of just, I stick with my ideal client. I try to focus on like what they'll be asking, what they'll be searching for, and things like that. And then it's trial and error a lot too. I mean, sometimes even like one pin does really well, and from the same post, the other pin does terrible, and it's nearly the same photo, So it's like that type of thing too is so crazy with Pinterest. It's like trying to understand that is pretty hard too. But again, it's a lot of trial and error with Pinterest, I feel like too.
Sure.
Which is kind of exciting. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think with pretty much any marketing effort, and certainly social media marketing efforts, there is definitely trial and error involved, which is okay. Yeah. But I mean, again, to your earlier stats, it's obvious that this can be a really great source of traffic and potentially clients. So taking advantage, first of all, of the tools that they built in. I mean, I actually went to trends.pinterest.com. And yeah, you can search certain terms, and they even have by default, for example, there's a heading here that says today's top Pinterest trends. And the first thing, it's kind of weird, but the first thing that comes up is olive oil cake. Have you ever made olive oil cake?
What? No.
Isn't that the most random thing?
And then it's so random.
Yeah. Father's Day gifts ideas from wife, graduation pictures, healthy dinner recipes, Weight Watchers recipes, tattoo ideas, female, end of year gifts for students, boho bedroom, graduation party decor. Anyway, those are the ones that popped up at the very top. But as you pointed out, like I'm going to type in, let's just see. I'm going to type in wedding photography. We'll try to do a color commentary play-by-play here. Yeah. So what's interesting actually is if we look at, it actually shows you trends, the amount of searches over time for that particular term. And then you can see popular pins associated with that particular search term as well. Nonetheless, taking advantage of these tools, making sure we're staying up to date as far as what's relevant and letting that help drive the content that we're posting, it's really important. I love that you said that you pay attention to the way that your clients communicate. You're using words that would resonate or be relevant to them. I think that's really important. And that really is a great segue to my next question, which is with regard to the blog content that you write. For anybody listening in, if you go to kristenkphotography.com/blog, you can see Kristen's blog there, but how do you let that content on Pinterest then drive the content that you're writing for your blog?
Yeah. So again, it's trial and error, right? So I'll blog, like different venues or things like that, things that I think people that are wanting, especially, right now it's mostly focused on Las Vegas, since we, just moved from there. But yeah, so focusing on what people might be searching for when they're, getting ready to elope in Las Vegas and, all those things. And so then from there, like one of my most popular ones is a brunch wedding at the Neon Museum, which I think why it's so popular is because the Neon Museum, it's a popular venue and it's so unique. And so people are able, like they'll kind of find it or start searching things like that. And mine has popped up over and over. And I think I wrote it like over a year ago, this blog post, but with Pinterest, that's the other really cool thing is that it's a long game, right? So a pin that I created 2 years ago can still be just as popular, now or 2-3 years from now. Like it lasts forever basically like on this platform. And so it's really cool. And so, yeah, I really try to look at which blogs are really performing well, like which posts, and then writing content around that, adding some more content or trying to figure out like what's doing the best, right? It's a lot of trial and error. But yeah, I don't know. It's so much that goes into it.
Yeah. Well, let me ask, when you talk about the long game with regards to blog posts and then how that relates to Pinterest, can you explain that in a little bit more detail? I think we may have even talked about this a little bit at Hybrid. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah. So with that, when you compare it to Instagram, right? Like Instagram posts, I think they say it's like a 24-hour basically is how long it lasts. So that is crazy compared to Pinterest where, it can last so long and it's a search engine. So Pinterest, it's not really social media. It's more of like a Google, right? It's more of a search engine. And so all of the posts and the pins and all of that on there can just keep getting like reshared and repinned and, and more traffic. And so sometimes some of them will kind of die out, but then if I repin them or kind of bring them back, like they'll come back and start driving more traffic. I mean, it's just crazy how, I mean, it's endless what you can do with it and the amount of pins. And even trying, you can kind of come back and say, okay, like this pin did really well. Let me pin another photo that is kind of similar to this and see how well that photo does, linking back to that same blog post. So things like that where you can kind of play with the pins that way and see how they go. But yeah, so it's a long game, honestly. I mean, there's some pins, if you look, I'll be repinning stuff and I'm like, oh my gosh, this was like wedding trends 2012. You're like, what? Like, how is this still, or like 2017?
Yeah.
You're like, oh my gosh, that's like 3 years old, but it's still circulating and still getting repinned like crazy. Like it's all over the place. And so that's what's so interesting with Pinterest is that sometimes, it's all this content that has been on there for years, but it's still getting shared and it's still relevant, especially if it's like evergreen content, which you probably talk about a bit, too, but it's like creating that evergreen content, not putting date stamps really on
Right.
blog posts, like that's not a good thing. So it's like curating that evergreen content where people can just keep sharing it and it feels like you just wrote it, a couple of weeks ago or a few months ago. It doesn't seem like it was 10 years old or 5 years old,
Well, and when that older content, especially like you were talking about 2012, a number of years ago,
Yeah.
does that content pop back up just simply through a search, or what? Do you know the technicalities behind what kind of pushes that back to the top, especially if it's that long ago?
Yeah. So I mean, of course it's like an algorithm and understanding algorithms is,
Sure.
like really complicated. But I think what probably does it is just, like people repinning again, or it being relevant still. Like Pinterest still sees it as being relevant.
Okay.
And I know now Pinterest, I kind of have this as like a tip, I think too, but Pinterest now, they are putting emphasis on fresh content. So before, I think people were kind of riding off of, they would get a popular pin and then they would just keep repinning that pin kind of like over and over, like every day, right? Just like repin, like that same pin. And Pinterest would be like, okay, cool. Like this must be popular. Well, now they're wanting fresh content. So like content creators are what is big and what they kind of want. Well, as photographers, it's like what we are, right? I mean, we all have hundreds of photos like from a session, so it's like we have the content and that's what they want. They want like the content, they want information, they want new things coming into Pinterest, not that repinning is bad. It's definitely not bad. And they still will allow that obviously, but they're really putting emphasis on kind of that new content. Like they want the new, what's trending now, what's new now, things like that.
Will you talk to me just briefly about your weekly workflow as it relates to Pinterest? Because I know that maybe some photographers are like, you know what, I'm already dealing with Facebook and Instagram and I'm blogging every once in a while. The idea of adding another social media platform and, trying to keep up with all the cute stuff on TikTok, like so many different things. The idea of like spending a lot of time, especially on an additional platform might be a bit overwhelming. Can you break down the amount of time that you're spending in a week and what that looks like, how you're spending that time for our listeners, just for some context?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's mostly like most of the time I spend would be on creating the blog post and creating a good blog post, right? Like that is where the bulk of it goes. So I'm learning a lot more about SEO and trying to figure, kind of that out and how many words you should include, like all of that stuff. I mean, that's all like pretty technical too, but just trying to think of terms like doing, SEM rush, things like that, like the SEO a little bit to really understand what would be a good topic to even write about, and then spending most of that time really writing, like getting the photos that I think will work best on Pinterest. So then, collecting all of that, getting all that ready. So after I've written the post, which sometimes writing a good post that takes a long time. Like it really can take a long time researching and, really doing all of that. But then after I've written it and gotten it all on my website, and organized, then I make sure that the images have like the metadata, like the descriptions, everything that you need kind of for that. And then once it's published, it's actually pretty easy to put it on Pinterest. Like all the hard work is done, honestly, with the blog post and the writing and all of that. So I use Tailwind, which is an app, and it's approved by Pinterest and actually Instagram as well. So they're not going, like Pinterest and Instagram won't what is it, like penalize you for using it. And it's a great tool. I absolutely love Tailwind. But so yeah, so I have the extension with Tailwind. So I'll go to my blog post that I just published. I'll click the Tailwind extension, and then it brings up all the images from that post, and all of the like the metadata and the like descriptions will kind of auto populate. And I just select which images I want to put into my Tailwind queue. And so I just select all of those, and it basically goes into the queue and it gets scheduled.
Wow.
And that's like mostly it. So I'm able to then also share there's something called Tailwind Tribes, which I don't know. Have you heard of those?
No.
Do you know? Okay. So Tailwind is like the overarching. And then within that, there's called these Tailwind Tribes. And it's kind of like, do you know, like Instagram pods or those kind of things, like where you would post and then someone would go and like and comment on your Instagram post. Like that was kind of popular. Yeah. So it kind of is like that, right? So I would share a pin that I just created. I would share it into this Tailwind Tribe, and it's full of people that say are, also pinning wedding or, whatever topic or niche that you're in. You'd find a tribe for that. And then they're able to share your content too with their followers. So it just really helps your reach. So sometimes I think some of mine have like 30 or 40 repins from those Tailwind Tribes alone. So from other people. And then I'm able to go in there and also share other people's content as well. So it kind of fills in when maybe I haven't blogged in a little bit, then I go back into my Tailwind Tribes and like find really good content to also share with my followers on Pinterest.
Wow.
So it's really cool.
Okay. And just for clarity's sake, and maybe most people figure this out, but the significance, of course, of the blog as it relates to Pinterest is that you are actually linking, those images are linked back to the blog post, which naturally sends people to your blog, to your website, generating the traffic that we're talking about. Again, most people probably figure that out, but I just wanted to make sure that was clear. So the blogging, how much time would you say that you spend on, if you were to guess, like on an average blog post?
Oh gosh. Because my website isn't the best and it's not an actual blog, it takes me a lot of time to like figure it out and make it, kind of look good. But that's why I'm going to rebrand and get a different website here soon. But I think writing it, sometimes it takes me just like a few hours, I'm able to really, sit down and I know what I need to say, and I know what I can write about that's kind of SEO and, it's got all those things with it. But then other times I'm like drawing a blank and it takes me a bit longer but maybe like 10 hours. I don't know. That's just like a random to kind of get everything together. I feel like that's pretty reasonable, but again, I should probably time myself so I can tell how long I spend doing it.
Well, 10 hours, it seems, that's a chunk of time, but if what you were talking about earlier is 60% of your weddings are actually coming from largely your blog. And of course, how that relates to Pinterest and Google and SEO. It seems like time pretty well spent. And I'm sure as you're talking about, as you get a newer website, that process will become even more streamlined, make it even easier for you. But the blogging and then using Tailwind, of course, we'll link to Tailwind and the Tailwind Tribes in the show notes at bokehpodcast.com for anybody who's curious, wants to jump over there. And I should go ahead and mention, too, just for further context for our listeners, what is your Pinterest username or the URL for your Pinterest?
Yeah, so it's just Kristen K Photography at the end. So like pinterest.com/Kristen K Photography. Okay,
perfect. Yeah, we'll link to that in the show notes so everybody can start commenting on and repinning your post too and drive even more traffic for you. But
thank you.
Y'all are going to want to see how Kristen is handling her account, because this is a really great example of what is possible. How do you track the results from your Pinterest posts? This may seem obvious, but is there a particular tracking tool or tools within Pinterest, or are you using some third-party tool to do that with?
No, so Pinterest has awesome analytics. They have, it's pretty robust. You're able to see how your pins are doing, how many clicks, how many saves, how many, repins or whatever, like all of that within Pinterest. And then also Tailwind, of course, they have their own analytics, which kind of mimic what Pinterest analytics are. But then again, you have like the Tailwind Tribe analytics as well, which is really cool. So you can see how many people have been pinning your pins, and then how how many people, like how many followers they have. So sometimes like the potential reach is like millions, just because of those people. They have a ton of followers, right? And they have a bunch of views on their Pinterest. So it's really cool to see those as well, with the Tailwind Tribe analytics. And then of course, Google Analytics is another big one. We kind of talked about that earlier too, but it's, really searching, okay, which pins are doing well? Is that translating to which blog post? Which I was going to mention as well, Pinterest does love when you link to an actual blog post that is relevant to the pin. They don't really want you just to link back to your website, like your homepage, right? They want it to be very specific. So like this image goes with this blog post. And they can tell. It's really crazy. That was one of my kind of extra tips as well. But Pinterest can read your pin. So if you put text on your pin, they can read that. And then they can tell, like they just gather all the information of like what's in the pin, what the photo is of. And then they check to make sure that those images are kind of like very similar and or are on your blog post that you're linking to make sure it all kind of goes together, and like integrity and, making sure all of that. So that's really interesting as well. So I think that's why too, like they really want it to be linked to something helpful, to a blog post, to something very specific, rather than just here's my homepage, kind of a thing. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
Okay, well that's good. And we'll link to all of these resources that you've mentioned in the show notes at bokehpodcast.com. For those of you listening in, I know I say it quite a bit, but if you don't take advantage of the show notes, you're kind of missing out, because we link to all the resources from each conversation. The talking points are there as well. And shout out to Haley for producing the show and making all that happen, putting that all together. Of course, if you're using a podcast app of some kind, you may also be able to see the show notes in there. Although it's the weirdest thing. I still, here we are 2020 and podcasts are as popular as they are. Not every podcast formats or podcast app formats show notes accurately, I guess you should say, the way that we've created them. So I have to try to figure out how to address that most effectively. But at the very least, bokehpodcast.com, see all the resources that Kristen has mentioned today. And Kristen, before we finish our conversation, you've alluded to some tips, some additional tips, and you had mentioned to me ahead of time that you had a few extra tips to throw in regarding using Pinterest. Can you go ahead and share those now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of mentioned them before, but I can kind of, sum them up. And so one of them was, is that Pinterest, they're putting the emphasis on the fresh content. So like I said, like for photographers, that's like a dream, right? It's like, oh, we have so many photos. We could easily post like a photo a day for probably like 20 years, So yeah, so that fresh content is what they're really liking. And then make sure, so when you take a pin and you put it, and you're ready to put it on, a different board, you're ready to schedule that, to put it on the board that is the most relevant. So if sometimes you have different boards that are, all kind of similar or things like that, but make sure that it goes to the most relevant board first, because Pinterest uses that to understand what's in the pin.
Okay.
So that's another tip. So make sure it goes to that. And then from there, once it's on that board, then you can kind of, repin and share it to other boards as well throughout. And another one that I've been kind of trying out to see if it helps at all or helps me get noticed. But so when somebody will repin, especially when it's my like Las Vegas elopement photos, I go into Pinterest and I can see the notifications of like which pins have been repinned and all of that. So I'll kind of go in like, maybe once a day or every other day, and I'll kind of scroll through and see who has repinned these Las Vegas elopements. And then if it's pinned to a wedding board, or sometimes it'll be like Vegas wedding or Vegas elopement, I'll follow either that board or I'll follow them. To kind of like, maybe they get like a little ping, like somebody followed you, and then I'm back kind of top of mind again, like, oh, hey, what is this about? And so they'll maybe come back to me or, hopefully like reach out. But I've kind of just started doing this, like maybe it's kind of creepy, but I'm trying to just, like kind of work out and see if that helps as well.
Well, I mean, it's not really any different than what we would do on Instagram or Facebook, right? Follow back, exactly. Or go like somebody else's pictures. So I don't think that's creepy.
Yep. Yeah, right. Okay, good. No, it's like,
I think
that's
you're
just
safe.
Something yeah, okay. Yeah, I just thought, because when you get those notifications and you can kind of see like what other pins they're pinning, it's really interesting too, to even just see, what they're finding relevant, what else they're looking at for Las Vegas elopements or for whatever your niche is, even just gathering that information. I mean, honestly, that's what I love about Pinterest. Like you can go so deep with it, and just get so much more information. And I feel like you're getting so much more bang for your buck, right? Like maybe it takes 10 hours, but that content can live on for 10 years, right? And it can continue bringing people. And an Instagram post, like that lives for a day. And then it's gone, So once I started doing that or realizing that, I put a lot more focus on Pinterest. Like I'm really bad at Instagram now because I put so much more focus on Pinterest. But I'm trying to get back into Instagram and like it again, but yeah, Pinterest, another great thing with Pinterest is you don't have to be catchy with your phrases. Like you literally describe what is in the photo. You describe what the blog post is about. You give some helpful tips or here is what my post is about. That's literally what you do with Pinterest. So for me, it was like, so nice not to have to get all creative with Instagram posts and, asking questions and things like that.
Well, this has been really helpful just to gain perspective, especially for those who aren't familiar with using Pinterest, at least not proactively anyway, for their marketing efforts. I mean, it's very obvious based on your statistics that a lot is possible. And it doesn't seem like the effort in and of itself has to be overly involved. And, 10 hours might seem overwhelming to some. We're not suggesting that it's going to take you 10 hours to write all of your future blog posts. Maybe some of you write faster or using a different tool you found more efficient, whatever the case. But the point is to write those blogs. And I really love, Kristen, that you highlighted the fact that photographers do have endless content. I've honestly been amazed kind of for a while when I hear photographers say that they're getting ready to work on their new website, and they say it with kind of this sense of stress and maybe a little bit of disdain and I got to go find pictures for my website. And when you just think about it, like we have these wonderful tools like Lightroom, for example. You import a wedding, whether you're having photographers process it or somebody else process it, or you're processing it yourself. It's not difficult to, after you've imported that wedding into Lightroom, to flag a few images or to star a few images, to process them. And then you can always go back to those. And if we shoot 20, 30 weddings a year or 50, 60 portrait sessions a year, there are endless images to pull from. And if when you look at those images after you shoot them, you've just flagged a few, then you always have the ability to very quickly go back and pull favorites from each of those. And so the idea of certainly putting a website together or updating a website, but writing blog content and having that ready for Pinterest isn't actually that complicated, or at least it doesn't have to be if we're leveraging the tools that are right there in front of us. So I want to encourage everybody listening in, every time you go do a shoot, again, whether you're processing the images or you're having somebody else process them, make sure that you at least flag a few for, social media, for blog posts, for Pinterest, and do that. Do that with 10, 15, 20 images from that group, depending on how many you shot all together. And it's very easy then to go back to that Lightroom catalog and pull those images later, and it doesn't have to be a source of stress. And for that matter, as Kristen's pointed out, it can actually be a source of business if you've got a great workflow in place like that.
Absolutely. And I will say too, so when you are flagging the images, so Pinterest tends to like vertical images, just because of the way the platform is, and they kind of stand out a little bit more. So mostly try to, kind of pin vertical images, because those tend to be what work best, but play around with it again. You never know, what image might end up being like really popular, really circulate a lot. But yeah, vertical tends to be. So make sure to at least have a few of those or something you can kind of crop to like a vertical that works like that. Yeah, because that's the best thing for Pinterest. Good to know.
Good to know. Well, I really can't thank you enough, Kristen, for making time to do the show today, for making time for our community. And just one more time, if you can remind our listeners where they can find you, your website and social media as well.
Yeah, so website is kristenkphotography.com. And then Instagram is Kristen and K, so Kay photography. And on Facebook too, same thing, Kristen K Photography. I'm not as active on Facebook, but yeah, Pinterest, you can find me on there too. And message me on Instagram or anything. If you have any follow-up questions, I'm happy to help people. I'm like obsessed with Pinterest, so I can gladly talk about it for a long time.
That's very gracious of you. And thank you not only for being willing to share with the individuals out there, but with all of us today and with me. And for everybody listening in, make sure you go check out the show notes from today, Bokeh, BOKEH podcast.com. Take advantage of those. And thanks once again, Kristen, for hanging out.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks so much, photographers, for listening to the Bokeh podcast. Will you let us know what you thought of the show by leaving a review of the podcast in the Apple Podcast app? And I'd love to hear from you personally with your thoughts about the podcast and suggestions about future topics and guests for the show. My email is nathan@bokehpodcast.com. We do try to bring this show to you commercial free, so make sure to check out our sponsors, photographersedit.com and Miilu, Miilu.com. Photographer's Edit is custom photo editing for the professional photographer, and Miilu is the simplest way to create and manage timelines and shot lists for the events you're photographing.